um, a lot of ground to cover today, and we'll see how much of it we get through. I really think of the content for today as being the real heart of what I had in mind. In a way, the first couple of days was just setting things up to be able to discuss these topics, and I was trying to set up an idea that we are situated in a historical moment of great importance for the planet, that history up until now and the history to come is, as I think all of us already have the firm intuition, is not just the rise and fall of kingdoms and the birth and death of people and aimless cycles, but history is telling a story. There's a thread to it. And one way to sum up what that thread is that the planet, not just human beings, but the entire planet is in the process of waking up and attaining consciousness. From the atoms that comprise the planet all the way up to the human societies, which are the most complex configuration on the planet. It's all part of a process. And the process ultimately can be summed up in the phrase impelling the development of consciousness. What's happening, the various forces that are at play, and in particular, as we're discussing the influence in history of the great religious traditions of the human race are all part of this principal force impelling the development of consciousness, to use the phrase in one common faith. Now, the word consciousness is not something that we find often in the writings of Baha'u'llah, of Abdu'l-Baha, or of the Bab. It is, however, we find a number of cognates, words that I think amount to the same thing. And so when we talk about consciousness as being central, and then we look, say, to the writings of Baha'u'llah and say, okay, so where can we find this message in the writings of Baha'u'llah? What we, I think, should really be looking for is reference to, in particular, a concept called the primal will, or the primal intellect, which I believe is essentially this force of consciousness that is being developed and being expressed in the world. There are actually many names for it. It is referred to very famously in the first verse of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This word, and the Greek is logos, also has connotations not just of a word in language, but a kind of an organizing principle, an active organizing principle. And this idea of word is found as creative principle, as sort of the origin point of things, is also found pervasively throughout the Baha'i writings, where it is often identified with will. So the word of God and the will of God, or the primal will, are treated really as the same thing. And by the way, in reference to this passage in the Gospel of John, Abdu'l-Baha comments on it. In the beginning was the Word. Abdu'l-Baha says this statement in Promulgation of Universal Peace, page 154. He says this statement is brief, but replete with the greatest meanings. Its applications are illimitable and beyond the power of words or books to contain and express. This idea of the creation being originated by a word, and by the way, that word in the Baha'i writings is often given in Arabic, it's kon, which is an imperative, literally meaning be. It is a fortunate accident in English. I don't know how it is in Danish, but it's a fortunate accident that that the word kon in Arabic is comprised of two letters, kaf and nun, which is very important. The accident is that the imperative be in English is also comprised of two letters. So you can talk about the letters B and E being joined and knit together, and it nicely translates the original concept from the Arabic. And in the Arabic, this primal word, the origin point of things, is comprised of this principle, these two principles, represented by the letters kaf and nun, which are the principles of form and substance. There's a tablet of the Bab where he says they also are the principles of the male and female principle. They're the active force and the recipient of the active force. But that takes us a bit into a different sort of alleyway, which I won't go down at the moment, because we're bringing it back to the idea of word. And what is the status of this word? Is that the same as God? Is it different from God? I mean, when we talk about theological concepts at this level, we're talking about things that we have no direct access to. These are, as it were, constructs of human thought. But the way it is described by Abdu'l-Bahá in Some Answered Questions, this is in chapter 82 of Some Answered Questions, he gives what I think could be regarded as quite a foundational statement on the overall structure of things if we're going to build a cosmology, which is what we're attempting to do. Abdu'l-Bahá contrasts the Baha'i view with that of certain of the Sufis. And he says it in the following, this is paragraph 17 of chapter 82. He says, in summary, the Sufis speak only of God and creation and believe that God has resolved himself into and manifested himself through the infinite forms of his creation, even as the sea which appears in the infinite forms of its waves. These originated and imperfect waves are identical to the pre-existent sea, which is the sum of all the divine perfections. This is the Sufi view. The prophets, however, hold that there are the world of God, the world of the kingdom, and the world of creation. Three things. And elsewhere, the world of the kingdom is identified with the realm of command, or the realm of the will, the realm of the primal word. And this realm and it is in relationship to the realm of command, or the realm of the word, that the Sufi conception of the ocean upon which all contingent things are the waves is true. So it is the case that, it is in this case that the pantheistic statement about all things being divine, about the world in its sum total, or in its essence, is God. The Baha'i teachings would correct that and say, about the realm of God, precisely nothing can be said. We can't even talk about its oneness. We can't even talk about its existence. These are all words, attributes we try to attribute to things in this world. And when we start getting into the business of attributing them to things in the realm of God, we are at the very first step going astray. So there's nothing we can say about that realm, except that it's in some way central to our thinking, but in this very slippery sense that we can't talk about it. What we can talk about, however, is the second of the three worlds, which is this realm of the will, of the word, which is the ocean upon which all contingent things are the waves and forms. That divine light within is a light of the will of God, not of the essence of God. The divine spark within the soul. Everything that whenever we talk about God, God's light, God's mercy, God's grace, when we pray to God and so forth, it's all in reference to this middle tier of the ringstone symbol and not the upper tier. So we're familiar with the imagery of the ringstone symbol comprising the 3 levels. That's what we're talking about. And really, there's no route to or path to the top tier in the ringstone symbol. There's no connectivity there even, which is why the ringstone symbol is already a, let's say, strictly speaking, inaccurate representation of the actual cosmology, because there's a connecting line that connects the top tier with the tiers below. And in a sort of causal sense, there is no connection between the top tier and the tiers below. There's actually a number of tablets of the Bab where he says this middle tier, this tier of the will, is self-generated. He says the primal will is generated through its own self. So important is it to establish the principle that there is no causality or no limitations whatsoever to be attached to the divine essence. The Bab makes clear that even to ascribe the attribute creator to God at the level of the essence is already to impose a constraint. And so the creation of the primal will has to be a sort of a self-creation. It goes to that length. So will then, as being the ocean upon which we are the waves, is something which is an absolutely pervasive phenomenon. It's like a light that shines upon everything, every atom. But it doesn't shine upon every atom like something from the outside shining on the earth. So although the imagery of emanation is also extensively deployed in the Baha'i writings, as it is from the Greek philosophers, Plotinus forward certain schools of Greek thought, and very much in the Islamic mystical tradition, which borrows heavily also from Greek thought. There's an idea of a metaphysics of emanation, that the universe it can be thought of as it were rays of light emanating from some source, and the substance of things is ultimately in reference to the rays of light. But already the imagery of emanation leads us astray, because there's a connection between the sun and the rays. But the way Abdu'l-Baha, and one can pull so many dozens of quotations on this pervasiveness of the will, pervasiveness of the emanation of the divine, which is the pervasiveness of, and to use another theological term, the grace of God within all things. There are so many passages in the Baha'i writings that describe this. And so picking one almost at random, this is from Selections for the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, number 19. He says, "And when thou dost gaze upon creation all entire, and dost observe the very atoms thereof, thou wilt note that the rays of the Sun of Truth are shed upon all things, and shining within them, and telling of that day star's splendors, its mysteries, and the spreading of its lights." This is a nice quote, because it's not that the light is shining upon the atoms of all things, it's shining within them. And so it subverts a bit the imagery of the imagery of emanation, which we immediately think of as kind of a top-down thing, and it flips the script, and it makes it more of an inside-out kind of a phenomenon, further establishing the idea that the foundations of things are the sea of the will. In another tablet of Abdu'l-Baha, he talks about God's grace, not in terms of light, but in terms of water. And this is another, and I also mentioned the imagery of the sea of the will. Abdu'l-Baha further goes into this idea of grace actually as rain, he says, and this is in Selections from the Writings of Abdu'l-Baha, selection 139. He says, "God's grace is like the rain that cometh down from heaven. The water is not bounded by the limitations of form, yet on whatever place it poureth down, it taketh on limitations, dimensions, appearance, shape, according to the characteristics of that place. The rain itself has no geometry, no limit, no form, but it taketh on one form or another according to the restrictions of its vessel. In the same way, the holy essence of the Lord God is boundless, immeasurable, but his grace and splendors become finite in the creatures, because of their limitations. So this is, using the theological language, paints a picture of God's will, God's grace being truly fundamental to things. Not something that's superimposed upon the world or above the world, but in a deeper sense, it is the world. It's a characteristic of everything from the atoms on up. And although I've been deploying theological language, obviously, because that's what the Baha'i writings use, what we're talking about easily transfers, I believe, to discussions of consciousness in the wider world, in the secular world. There's a particular phrase, a particular word that you may have heard of called panpsychism, which is a little bit has a past going back a few centuries. I think it was, I don't know if it was Leibniz. I don't think it was Leibniz who first got the idea of panpsychism, but it was something I think around the 1700s. The idea sort of hung around a bit at the fringes of of discussions of consciousness in the philosophy world, but it's still there and taken seriously by a number of people. The idea that consciousness, and we're talking not from a religious lens, but people actually thinking professionally as philosophers about what is consciousness, and is there a hard line separating the consciousness that we attribute to ourselves from from everything else in the world, and our everyday notion of consciousness. It's hard to imagine that our particular mode of consciousness, our awareness of things, our awareness of self, could possibly be experienced by, say, snails or lumps of rock, because they don't possess the ganglia and the neurons, the brain, the complexity of the brain to have those sorts of experiences. And I believe that's true, but I also think that it may be doing the notion of consciousness a disservice, certainly from the perspective of the Baha'i writings, to imagine that there's this clear, bright line between the consciousness that we have and the consciousness, say, experienced by a dog or a monkey, or all the way down, to simpler animals. It may be more correct to say that awareness of things is something which exists on a sliding scale, that everything partakes of it to some degree. Now, when we get down to the minerals, the rocks, the atoms, it becomes very abstract what we're talking about if we want to make this claim that consciousness is a property of matter, even at the elemental level. What are we talking about when we talk about the consciousness of a rock? Because if we're going to extend this idea, the idea of consciousness being all pervasive, we have to explain what we mean when we talk about consciousness at that level. And Abdu'l-Baha talks about this in a number of talks. He talks about, and the word that Abdu'l-Baha uses is spirit. And so I've talked about consciousness as being somewhat equivalent in some ways to the grace of God. I've talked about it as somewhat equivalent to the divine emanation, as equivalent to this concept of the word of God, of the will of God, of the divine intellect. There's a whole constellation of concepts circling around this idea of consciousness, which in some ways overlap, either partially or completely. And I think another one of the concepts which is obviously deeply interfused in the Baha'i writings is the idea of spirit. What is spirit? It's one of these indefinable things that could mean different things depending on how you're using the word. There's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he says spirit exists in these different levels. And actually, if I can find it, I might not be able to find it on the fly, but there's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he says that there's basically two modes of in which the word spirit is referred to in the Baha'i writings. And in the first mode, it's very much aligned with what we've been talking about. Spirit existing in the mineral, in the vegetable, in the animal, in all kingdoms of existence, there's spirit. And the spirit of the mineral is the force of cohesion. It's simply that. It happens to be the case that the spirit of the mineral is well described mathematically. We know what the equations are to explain how minerals work, how atoms work. Electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, gravity. You know, you can put them on a T-shirt, and we understand things at that level. And while the physicists would say, well, this is math, this is the laws of physics, from the perspective of what I'm going to call divine philosophy, what Abdu'l-Baha calls divine philosophy, we're describing spirit. It's two different language games, to go back to a phrase of Wittgenstein. We're talking about the same thing. It's just you can deploy theological language to talk about the spirit of the mineral, as Abdu'l-Baha does, or you can deploy the language of science to talk about exactly the same thing. And one language is suited to one set of purposes, and the other language is suited to a different set of purposes. You know, if you want to make precise predictions about what it does when you heat it up, you're going to want to use the language of science. But if you're talking about situating these realities within a larger framework of meaning, then it may be more apropos to use the theological language to talk about spirit. Anyway, I mentioned that there's this tablet of Abdu'l-Baha where he says there's two ways in which spirit is described. The first way is, I would argue, more or less equivalent to consciousness, or at least in that ensemble of words. The second way Abdu'l-Baha talks about spirit, which we're going to get into more tomorrow, is what Baha'is often call the spirit of faith, which one can actually situate it within the hierarchy of spirit as a higher degree of recognition that the human spirit attains when it is touched by the breath of the Holy Spirit. And we'll get more into spirit in that sense when we talk about dimensions of individual spirituality tomorrow. But today we'll try to confine the conversation to this, to what we might call the foundations of divine philosophy, as Abdu'l-Baha discusses it, and the circle of creation, which we're coming up to. So we're on this idea of consciousness, spirit, mind, will, grace being fundamental to creation, and being in a way the substance of things. This consciousness, which is the real substance of things, is not a passive thing. It's not like an inert substance that just is the bedrock of things, but it's constantly in motion. Consciousness never rests. It's in its nature to expand itself, you know, both into the horizons and into its own self, both outwardly and inwardly, to paraphrase a quotation from the Quran. It is in its very nature to try to complete itself. It's as though it's born into a state of incompletion, and it's the nature of consciousness to try to complete itself. And the completion of consciousness is when it attains it, and when it attains its fullest and highest expression is when it attains consciousness of its own self. This goes back to the inscription on the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece. Know thyself. You know, Socrates knew this already. The divine Socrates, as the Baha'i writings call him, understood that the knowledge of self is the highest, you know, end point of knowledge. This is something that, because the knowledge of self is ultimately equivalent to the knowledge of God. We know from the hidden words of 1,000 other places that the divine light shines within. If we're going to look for God, one can look for God in the universe, and one can find signs and traces everywhere, but that divine light is shining most powerfully and clearly within human hearts. In that sense, consciousness reaches its completion when it when it closes the circle, when the eye of regard is able to fully turn inward and recognize the divine within. And of course, by extension, is able to recognize that same divine light as it shines within other souls. One can think of this as a deeper stage of the understanding of the organic unity of the human race. It's not simply that we share the same DNA. It's not simply that we are all the same species and we're all in it together and we all need to work together for our own survival. That's one level of thinking about unity. A deeper way of thinking about unity is that we are all possessors of that same spark of consciousness. The expression of consciousness in motion in the world has a word in science. It's called evolution. Things are in motion in a sort of, at least three levels: in a cosmic level, at a biological level, at a human level. There's evolution. There is the gradual, somehow in the face of the absolute apparent improbability of it all, because according to the well-established laws of physics, things ought to be getting more and more disordered with time. Anything organized should be burning itself out. All the atoms of the universe are destined in the fullness of time to just be spread out evenly across the universe. There is an inevitability to entropy and to the disorder of things, against which we see this mysterious, incredible process, both in the cosmic sense, in the biological sense, in the human sense, of things going in the opposite direction from what we would expect. They're moving from the simple to the complex. Cosmologically, we see the ultimate simplicity of the moments after the Big Bang, when everything is just a soup of elemental particles and vast amounts of heat and light. But we see in time the crystallization and the condensation of matter into more and more complex configurations, into stars and planets and galaxies, which have a degree of stability for a period of time, which allows for the emergence and the appearance upon them of life, which is still a great mystery as to how and why it is that life appears. One can argue that in a big enough universe, with enough throws of the dice, you'll eventually get life. One can also argue that there is a principle, perhaps definable scientifically, perhaps not, it remains for the future to tell, but a principle of order superimposed upon this larger principle of disorder. And it's in accordance with this principle of order, which we might call the primal will, that life ultimately emerges and doesn't just remain at the bacterial level, at the unicellular level, but that life, as it thrives, complexifies. Single cells come together to form larger units. Those units specialize. And it's in the specialization of those units and the complexification of matter that higher and higher potentialities of matter become manifest. As if by magic, you get enough cells together, differentiated in a particular way, and lo and behold, you have an eye spot. You have something that can start sensing photons and start reacting to them. You start getting simple life forms that have the rudimentary senses. And with enough billions of years, those rudimentary life forms become people whose complexity is unrivaled by any other known object in the universe, although that's quite a reach to say that. We can say, I think for sure, on this planet anyway, we don't know yet the state of possible life on other planets, but the universe is a big place. And if, as we suspect, life is a tendency of matter rather than being some vast improbability, then we would expect there to be life, indeed advanced forms of life, elsewhere in the universe. This would be consistent with this idea of consciousness being fundamental to things, and there being an arrowhead to the evolutionary process that isn't pointing in the direction of entropy and disorder. One might say that this prediction, if you will, of there being advanced life itself being pervasive throughout the universe, and probably advanced life being also in existence throughout the universe, one might say that this is a prediction of divine philosophy. There's very few cases where you can say a theological point of view allows you to make some prediction about the physical world. I think this may be one of them. If the universe wants to be alive, if the universe is waking up, and if this waking up is somehow part of the internal programming of things, then we would predict there to be intelligent life in the universe. This says, of course, nothing about things like UFOs and purported observations of intelligent life having visited this planet, which is, I think, strictly a matter for scientific investigation. I got a note to try to slow down, so I'll try to slow down. I apologize if this is I'm getting ahead of people here.
And a raised hand.
There's so much to get through.
There's also a raised hand.
Yes, pause for raised hand.
So what you're talking about is the second law of thermodynamics, right?
Yes.
And are you basically saying that you don't think it's a valid law?
Of course it's a valid law. It's the most valid law, that it's probably the most well-tested physical law out there. So what I'm suggesting is that I'm certainly not suggesting that the existence of life violates the second law of thermodynamics. Life generates a lot more disorder. A lot more entropy is generated by the processes of life than the negative entropy, which is represented by the life form itself. So strictly speaking, the existence of life on this planet is not in contradiction to the second law of thermodynamics. It may seem vastly improbable, and complexity theorists, people involved in chaos theory, turbulent dynamics and so forth, they might argue that that the existence of life on this planet is made possible by this continuing source of low entropy in the form of solar energy that's constantly bathing the planet. And that's what allows this island of apparent stability to exist. So I'm talking about evolution as being an expression of this ever-moving consciousness, of this ever-moving sea of the will, whose waves are constantly beating upon the shores of creation. And I hope I'm not giving too much of the end away by saying that the primal will, Baha'u'llah says, is the same thing as nature. So we've been talking for the last half an hour in very theological, we've been using the apparatus of theological language. We're talking about God and spirit and grace and faith and all of this. Whereas we could take the same conversation and transfer it into the language of consciousness, the language of nature. How do we know we can do this? Well, Baha'u'llah says we can. In the Tablet of Wisdom, which is one of the tablets published in Tablets of Baha'u'llah after the Kitabi Akdas, Baha'u'llah identifies nature with the primal will. And this is such an important passage that that I should read it to you in its entirety, although it's quite short. I almost have it memorized. Yes, someone raised their hand.
Yeah, just when you're ready.
Yes. Yeah, I can take a question now as I'm finding this quote.
Gisela?
Yes. I remember having read, but I'm not quite sure in which of Baha'u'llah's tablet, there's a passage where he says that the force spent is restored. I always thought that this is like, you know, undoing the entropy. Will you remember this passage?
That the horse,
The force.
the force which is spent,
Spent itself and is
which spent itself and is restored.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
in the cleaning somewhere, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I'm familiar
One
with
righteous
that.
act. It's that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I mean, I can't say anything more, but yeah.
Okay.
The quote I was looking for, I found it. So this is from the Tablets of Baha'u'llah. It's page 142 in the English edition. At least in one version. Now there's various editions, so that doesn't necessarily get you there, but you can easily find it on Google. That's how I found it. Baha'u'llah says, nature is the essence. Nature in its essence is the embodiment of my name, the maker, the creator. Its manifestations are diversified by varying causes, and in this diversity there are signs for men of discernment. Nature is God's will and is its expression in and through the contingent world. It is a dispensation of providence ordained by the ordainer, the all-wise. Were anyone to affirm that it is the will of God as manifested in the world of being, no one should question this assertion. So Baha'u'llah seems to be drawing an equation here, saying nature, will of God. You know, as far as this world is concerned, we can equate those two. That's very helpful, because that allows us to take the theological language with which we may be used to describing things, translate it into the language of consciousness and nature and entropy and these sorts of things, and it's possible for us to be describing the same thing. Let me give an example of this that just popped up a few weeks ago. I don't know how many people saw an article written by Nader Saidi, and it was published in, I'm sharing screen now, I hope. It was published in Baha'íTeachings.org. And look at this amazingly deft thing that Nader Saidi has done. He's taken what Baha'i children learn, the first thing Baha'i children learn when they're 6, the 3 onenesses. God is one, man is one, and all the religions agree. We have a song for it. Most Baha'is, if you said, what are our core teachings, reduce it to the, what are the 3 core teachings? This is probably it. Oneness of God, oneness of religion, oneness of mankind. Nader Saidi has found a quotation by Baha'u'llah, which he has then used to translate the theological language of the 3 onenesses into the language of consciousness. And how has he done this? There's a quote by Baha'u'llah which says, "Incline thine ear and hear. This is the voice of my pen raised before mystics, then divines, and then kings and rulers." And Saidi looks, and this is also chronological, to the mystics, Baha'u'llah was speaking mainly in the Baghdad period, and to divines and kings and rulers in the Adrianople and Akka periods. So when Baha'u'llah is raising his call to the mystics, Nader Saidi writes in this article, he's talking about mystical consciousness. What is this mystical consciousness? It's the consciousness of that divine reality which lies within, which is the same reality shared, by all other human hearts, and indeed that same light which is shining within every atom. This is one expression of the Baha'i principle of the oneness of God, this pervasiveness of this one light which is reflected through all things, which is one of the great realizations of the mystics, of the divine nature of the self. Then Baha'u'llah addresses the divines. And here Nader says this is referring to historical consciousness. The divines never understood the essential oneness of religion. because they took every instance of the divine in history as, you know, each group of divines took their own particular religion as being the final expression of things. And if they could see with a proper historical consciousness, they could see the evolutionary nature of man's conversation with and encounter with the divine throughout history. This is the principle of the oneness of religion. And when Baha'u'llah addresses the kings and rulers, Saidi says this is referring to global consciousness, our consciousness of the boundaries of the planet being the real boundary we should be talking about, not the artificial political boundaries that we draw on maps. With the true global consciousness, we are aware of the Baha'i principle of the oneness of mankind. But I love how he translates this into different kinds of consciousness of things. And the arenas of this, by the way, are the arenas of the self, of time and space. To use a phrase in the Quran again, the afaq and the anfus, the horizons and the self. You know, we shall show them our signs in the horizons and within their own selves. And the horizons are space and time and their own selves. It's just a wonderfully packaged way of taking some very high level ideas and translating into two different kinds of languages, a theological kind of language and language of consciousness. Let me stop sharing and come back. Okay, so we're talking about consciousness as being an active force in the world, as generating these evolutionary processes that culminate in the appearance of humanity on this planet. But that doesn't stop there, because then human beings, just like individual atoms and just like individual cells, coming together in more and more complex configurations that allow the differentiation of the parts. I'm sorry again if my natural speaking pace gets too fast. It's hard. It's really hard when you've established a natural speaking pace to slow it down. I'll try really hard. But evolution doesn't stop with the appearance of the human being on the planet, because human beings then gather together into more and more complex configurations. We mentioned briefly a couple days ago this idea from Harari's book Sapiens about Dunbar's number, and how for a long time that limited the kinds of configurations that human societies could attain up until the appearance of abstract thought, which is an expansion of consciousness. And with that expansion of consciousness, we're able to start imagining our relationships to others in different ways, which allowed us to start organizing at higher and higher levels, which ended up being a prerequisite to the appearance of still higher degrees of consciousness, of still higher degrees. It takes a big society to have people with the kind of free time and resources to devote their lives to art, to music, to investigation in the pure sciences. That cannot be done on a tribal level. That has to be done at a nation state level or above. And we can only imagine, I think, at this stage, what kinds of potentialities will be released when the human race advances beyond the nation state level, which has been able to produce the amazing arts and sciences that we've already seen. When humanity starts coordinating at the global level, what additional levels of potentiality will be unlocked by our self-organization attaining that highest level which is possible on this planet. So what I'm describing is what Abdu'l-Baha in chapter 83, I believe, of Some Answered Questions describes as the arcs of descent and ascent. Abdu'l-Baha says that that creation can be described as a circle, the most perfect geometric form, the most simple form that we know, the most simple and perfect shape. That happens to describe the world. And a circle can be, in our minds at least, divided into two halves. And one can imagine the circle as something which is not just a static thing, but it's continually in motion. This motion is constantly turning. The motion of the circle is so going back a half a sentence, I suppose. Abdu'l-Baha describes the universe as a circle comprising two arcs, an arc of descent and an arc of ascent. The descending arc is the arc of physical evolution. And the highest point of physical evolution is the appearance of the human being with our highest, on this planet, degree of consciousness that exists. The ascending arc then is describing the degrees of spiritual progress. This idea of the arc of ascent and the circle of existence goes back to very ancient times, but it's something that Abdu'l-Baha spoke with, I believe this was Louis Getzinger, and let me just focus on the image. You may have seen this image. Those who have visited the mansion of Bahá'í in Haifa may have seen this on the upper floor in one of the rooms on the upper floor of the mansion of Bahá'í. It is a diagram based on a talk that Abdu'l-Baha gave, I believe, to Louis Getzinger in the early years of the 20th century. And this includes, I think, a lot more detail than we necessarily need. But the basic idea is here, that there is a descending arc on the left comprising the different degrees of the physical realm, traditionally the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, the human. The human represents the lowest point, the furthest point in this arc from its origin point, and then the arc is completed through the varying spiritual degrees attainable by the human consciousness. This is in a nutshell. You could say this is Baha'i cosmology 101, I suppose. But up here, I would correct this, because up here it's not God that's at the upper reach. It's the will. It's the word of God the thing that was there in the beginning in the book of John. And it's important to maintain that distinction because of the theological stance of the Baha'i faith, that the essence of God is radically unknowable. So we cannot situate God as an agent within any kind of cosmology, but we can talk about the will of God, which arguably is just a semantic distinction.
Can you?
So,
Okay.
all right, I think I just stopped sharing. Yeah. So we have an idea of consciousness being at the ground of things and driving this circle of creation. The circle of creation is constantly in motion, and the highest physical point attained in the circle of creation is the human being, the human will. Abdu'l-Baha says, in relation to this consciousness and its relation and the ocean of consciousness, the ocean of the will, and the human reality. In one of Abdu'l-Baha's tablets published in Journal of Baha'i Studies, and you can find this if you Google a phrase, he says, the primal will, which is the realm of command, is the inner reality of all things. And all beings are therefore the manifestations of the divine will, not the manifestations of the divine essence and reality itself. His Holiness the Bab hath stated that the meaning of the verse, the sea hath ever been the sea, and all contingent things, its waves and forms, is fulfilled in the primal will, not in the divine essence. So when we talk about what ultimately is of what stuff are we made, and Carl Sagan in his famous series Cosmos opens it by saying we are all made of star stuff. I'm not sure he opened the series with that, but he famously says we are all made of star stuff. It may be closer to what Shakespeare said. We are such stuff as dreams are made of. We are all made of soul stuff. And what is that soul stuff? It's the ocean of the will, which is that ocean of consciousness which underlies everything from the atomic level up. Now, the yearning of the will to know itself, to complete that circle of existence, is love in its most primordial form. So now I'm introducing the concept of love, not in its touchy-feely sense, but in its cosmological sense. Love is this yearning of the will to know itself. Whereas, and this, we can say, it's almost as though the world is the will to consciousness. It's not the will to power, as certain German philosophers would have said, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. They say, in the end, here's when you dig down and get down to what's fundamental, they say it's all the will to power. I think the Baha'i writings would say, no, it's the will to consciousness. And the will to consciousness is affected through this force and power of love. And it's in doing so that one recognizes the power and force of love that exists within every human heart, and which is the true origin of our idea of the intrinsic worth and dignity of humankind. But at a higher cosmic level, this yearning of the will to know itself is described by Abdu'l-Baha in Paris Talks, in one of the later talks in Paris Talks, where Abdu'l-Baha says that there are 4 kinds of love. And some of us may be familiar with this. And he says it in the following way. He said, love is only of the 4 kinds that I've explained. The love of God towards the identity of God. Christ has said that God is love. The love of God for his creation, for his servants. The love of man for God, and the love of man for man. Those 4 kinds. He said, these 4 kinds of love originate from God. These are the rays from the sun of reality. These are the breathings of the Holy Spirit. These are the signs of reality. But regarding this first kind of love, the one that's hardest to sort of grasp, the love of God for his own essence, Abdu'l-Baha says it's through a ray of this love that all the other love comes to exist. So there's something primordial about God's love for his own essence. And we have to realize, we have to step back at some point in this discussion and realize that we don't know what we're talking about when we're saying these words. You know, what does it mean to say God loved his own essence? I mean, this is probably committing multiple errors already at once. We're treating God as a person. We're anthropomorphizing God, to be able to say that God loves. How can God love his own essence? How can that bring creation into being? And how can all that happen with there being no connection between God and creation? I mean, there's just so many philosophical problems that one could bring up with this. And I can only say that what we're talking about is a narrative, to use the phrase that from the last couple of days. And ultimately, we judge the narrative, especially when narratives reach into these realms that the senses never reach and logic never reaches. When we're talking about narratives that tell us all about what's going on up there, the only way to judge these narratives is on the basis of, do they work? Are they useful? I'm suggesting a pragmatic litmus test ultimately. If this narrative helps us solve a problem, then that's why we should adopt it. Because ultimately, none of us can say, well, you're wrong about this idea of God's loving his own essence because, I know otherwise. It's like, no one has any ability to argue about what's right or wrong in here. We are talking about concepts which are either going to have a positive force in the world or they're not. And as I get to the end of this, I'll talk about what problems this narrative solves. Because you may be wondering already, this is very theoretical. This is very sort of up in the air. When is this going to get practical? When is this going to be? When is this going to actually solve some real problems? I will get there. But first of all, we've introduced the idea of love and as connected to consciousness, love as being the yearning of the expression of the yearning of the will to know its own self. Abdu'l-Baha calls it this first kind of love, the love of God for his own essence. In the Hidden Words, Baha'u'llah says it's almost the same thing in similar terms. He says, veiled in my immemorial being and in the ancient eternity of my essence, I knew my love for thee, therefore I created thee, have engraved on thee mine image and revealed to thee my beauty. And of course, God's love for us is reciprocated by our love for God, which completes the arc of ascent. Something which we are asked to remember every day in the short obligatory prayer, that we've been created to know and to worship God, and also to love God. So what we find is throughout creation, the force of love is the coming together of things. And it's through that coming together of things that unlocks higher potentialities. It's the, let's say, love of hydrogen atoms for each other, at least a love mediated by the tremendous pressures in the hearts of stars that causes them to fuse together and to release vast amounts of energy that ends up lighting up the cosmos and powering and enabling all life on this planet. When Baha'u'llah says, so powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth, that statement is perhaps not coincidentally, perhaps coincidentally, quite literally true in the physical realm. You know, the light of unity is the light of the hydrogen atoms coming together through this cosmic force of love to illumine the whole earth. All other love that we can talk about, the love of the creatures for the creator, the love of the creator for the creatures, the love of the creatures for each other, are all derivatives of this cosmic love, which is this tendency to complete the circle of existence. In this sense, love is the single unchanging core of all religions. When we talk about there being two parts to religion, there's the unchanging part, the eternal part, and then there's the changing part, which is all the laws and ordinances, which can be very different. Shoghi Effendi, Abdu'l-Baha, to my knowledge, never said in a talk or a tablet, well, these are the unchanging parts, A, B, and C. We sort of left for us to infer it, except that Baha'u'llah revealed a tablet which he identifies what that single unchanging core is. Unfortunately, and this quotation was translated by Shoghi Effendi in 1918 or 1917. It ended up being published in a very obscure Baha'i journal, the Baha'i Journal of Burma and India. It was a journal called The Dawn. It was published in that journal and somehow never made it into the mainstream of English speakers in the Baha'i world. But it's a very short, beautiful quotation. And this is in The Dawn, Volume 5, number 12, for those who care to chase it down. Baha'u'llah says, know thou that in every age and cycle, all laws and ordinances have been changed according to the requirements of the times, except the law of love, which like a fountain ever flows and whose course never suffers change. That's the foundational principle, which has its various expressions. We see in this circle of existence, which is driven by this force of love, we see their patterns repeated all the way up and down the arcs of ascent and descent. By patterns, I mean things that are seen at one level, similar sorts of configurations are seen at the next level. This idea of repetition is, I think, another one of the, let's say, foundation stones we might put into an edifice of divine philosophy. Baha'u'llah puts it in the following words, and this is provisionally translated from a tablet called the Lohe Hakun Nas, and it's in Persian, available in Persian in Ma'adeh Osmani Volume 7. He says, and this is, I think, really quite fundamental. He says, know thou that whatsoever can be found in this mortal world, this realm of limitation, every name and description, every form and attribute that can be seen or heard, hath in each world of the worlds of God, manifestations and appearances corresponding to and befitting that world, and appearing with another name, another description, another form, and another attribute. I'll read that one more time because it's kind of complex, but it expresses, I think, a very profound thought.
Stephen?
Know thou that whatsoever, sorry, yeah.
No, just an idea. Those two quotes, this one that you're going to read now and the one that you referred to earlier, is it possible that you could copy them into the chat so we can follow along
yeah,
a little
absolutely.
bit better?
Oh,
Or
I should
share
be,
your screen.
yeah.
Or...
If I was a little more present, I would have been doing that all along. I'm sorry for not doing that. Okay, there it is. Know thou that whatsoever can be found in this mortal world, Nasut, the realm of limitation, every name and description, every form and attribute that can be seen or heard, hath in each world of the worlds of God manifestations and appearances corresponding to and befitting that world, and appearing with another name, another description, another form, and another attribute. There is a repetition of archetypes, it seems. There are certain fundamental patterns that get expressed and re-expressed all along the arcs of descent and arcs of ascent. And when we start looking for these patterns, we can see, maybe I can give what I think may be an example of it. In the mineral realm, there is an idea, and it's the idea of transformation. The idea that something that in a certain condition can be fundamentally transformed to show forth a very different kind of attribute, a higher attribute, is one of those, I think, potentialities that exists in different degrees along the arcs of descent and ascent. What does transformation look like in the mineral realm? Well, it could be something like crystallization. An amorphous mass subjected to the right conditions can take on a crystalline form, and in so doing, it can reflect and refract rays of light in ways that it couldn't do when it was just an amorphous mass. Transformation, what is transformation in the vegetable realm? Well, one way that, and there's different ways that one could point out the phenomenon of transformation in the vegetable realm, but one of them is through cultivation. And I give the example of cultivation because this transformation is facilitated by a higher level. You know, when the farmer cultivates the land, prunes certain branches, waters it, takes care of diseases and so forth, it produces the full measure of the fruits of the abundance that it potentially had. But the thicket and the plot full of weeds is transformed under the loving attention of the gardener to abundance that then serves the needs of still higher realms. In the animal realm, transformation can be seen in domestication, and this takes place over much longer periods of time. When animals with certain properties are selectively bred to increase their strength, their speed, their resistance to disease and so forth, to serve the needs of a still higher degree of consciousness, a still higher degree of existence. And then, of course, there's transformation in the human realm. Education, through the power of education, those minds, those gems which lay hid within the minds of human potentiality are brought out, and human characters are transformed. And still higher, there's spiritual transformation of consciousness, as we've already mentioned, through the breath of the spirit. The consciousness is opened, and we call this spiritual transformation, the second birth, the spirit of faith. So that's an example of how the idea of transformation can be thought of as almost an archetypal pattern which has existences in each of the realms of God, in each of the worlds of God, as Baha'u'llah says in this quotation, but appears with another name, another description, another form, and another attribute. Maybe there's better examples out there than the one I've given. But this principle of there being repeated patterns seems to be fundamental, not just to the physical world, but to the spiritual realm. What we see, I think, as we go deeply into these principles of divine philosophy, we find that some of the deepest principles end up connecting, coincidentally or not, with some of the deepest principles that scientists have uncovered about the operations of the physical world. There's a book by Frank Wilczek, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, called A Beautiful Question. And in this book, he talks about some of these fundamental laws of physics. And his list, when he narrows it down to what the most fundamental physical principles are, he basically narrows it down to basically three things. Relativity, the principle of relativity, the principle of complementarity, and the principle of symmetry. He actually gives four, but he gives symmetry and invariance, and symmetry and invariance are really aspects of the same thing. The principle of relativity, well known in science, attached to the name Einstein, is perhaps most obviously connected to the spiritual principle of the relativity of religious truth, the relativity of viewpoints as one is traversing the circle of existence. How one perceives the world is a function of where you are on that circle of existence. Complementarity is a similar principle in the realm of physics, which undergirds the theory of quantum mechanics. We've all heard about the strange complementarity between particles and waves in quantum mechanics, how depending on how you set up an experiment, you may observe elementary particles as having either particle or wave-like properties, but you somehow can't observe it having both of those properties at the same time. In fact, when you observe a particle, by definition, you're observing it as a particle. It makes a spot on a photographic plate. Once it's measurable, however, its wave-like behavior becomes unmeasurable. Niels Bohr, one of the architects of quantum mechanics, took this idea of complementarity and gave it, I think, a far more philosophical or even spiritual spin when he said the opposite of a fact is falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth. And I haven't described this much yet, and we're going to talk about this more tomorrow, about the principle of complementarity in the spiritual realm. But the third principle mentioned by Wilczek is the idea of symmetry, which undergirds so fundamentally the formulation of the laws of physics at the most basic level. And without getting into the details of the mathematical symmetries that underlie the laws of nature, we find similarly in this quotation by Baha'u'llah and elsewhere, an expression of the principle of symmetry in the spiritual realm with these repeating patterns, with the correspondence of the microcosm to the macrocosm, of the human heart to the universe, with the correspondence of the spiritual to the physical. And it's in particular with respect to the correspondence of the spiritual to the physical that I want to suggest that this narrative I've certainly not created, but hopefully extracted from the Baha'i writings, and in particular from some of the foundational quotations that I've presented, one of the most foundational being the passage in Some Answered Questions about the arcs of ascent and descent. this narrative of the circle of existence, I think, has very practical, pragmatic applications. One of the most fundamental is that it can help bridge otherwise unbridgeable divides between, on the one hand, Western and Eastern religious sensibilities, and on the other hand, sacred versus secular sensibilities. So we're talking about two of the biggest problems, you know. How do you resolve the conflict between science and religion? How do you resolve the conflict between one religion and another religion? It seems that you need some kind of meta-narrative framework within which all of these can be validated within their own perspective, but which offers a larger view that can helpfully draw them together and hopefully provide a platform or a foundation for pragmatic, unified action in the world. How is it the case that this idea of a circle of existence can resolve the psychological spiritual rift between Eastern and Western thought? I want to just suggest in a few sentences what would probably take quite a bit longer to address appropriately. And that is going back to what I mentioned briefly earlier, that where you are on this circle of existence determines your worldview, very fundamentally. If you are, and there's a statement by Abdu'l Baha in one of his talks that very briefly, I think, gives us the key to understanding how this is. And I'm pulling it up right now, and I'm going to stick this one in the chat box. This is quite an important one. So this is Abdu'l Baha. He says, the deniers ask in their disbelief, where is that world, the spiritual world? For whatsoever hath no actual material existence is sheer imagination. But the truth is that the world of existence is a single world, although its stations are manifold in accordance with the manifold realities of things. For instance, the world of mineral, plant, and animal existence is the same world. Despite this, the animal world, in relation to the world of the vegetable, is a spiritual reality and another world and abode. The animal world, in relation to the world of the vegetable, is a spiritual reality. In that brief sentence, we have turned on its head centuries of philosophical thinking about dualism versus monism. Very briefly, because we're running out of time and I want to reserve at least a few minutes for questions. The idea behind philosophical dualism, which I suspect undergirds the thinking of a lot of people in the Baha'i community today, and probably most people, certainly in the Western, within the Western Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, is that there is fundamentally a divide between the material and the spiritual. There's matter and what we observe, what science describes, and then there's spirit. Two different kinds of substances. Philosophically, it's called substance dualism. Descartes gave the fullest, perhaps, defense of substance dualism in his meditations on written in the mid-late 1600s. And from the perspective of the circle of existence, one can see how substance dualism can be both true and false. How is it that you get both monism and dualism out of the circle of existence? Well, first of all, there's only one circle. So there's your monism. Yeah, there's only one world, as Abdu'l Baha said in the quotation. But, as Abdu'l Baha says, from the perspective of the vegetable, the animal is spirit. So we're taking the idea of spirit as another kind of substance, and we're replacing it with a whole different conceptual framework in which what is spirit is what is ahead of you along the arc of descent or along the arc of ascent. Whatever is ahead of you along the circle of creation is spirit. So you're at the vegetable stage of the vegetable, animal, and everything beyond that is spirit. You're at the stage of the human, and everything beyond the human, what we call spirit, well, that's spirit to us, and whatever's behind us along the arc of descent is what we call matter. So what you call spirit and matter, how you divide up the world, is a feature of where you are along the circle of existence. And as you can imagine, as human consciousness develops, what we consider matter and spirit might change in its definition. It wasn't that many centuries ago when lightning and the coming of the harvest and all of these things, earthquakes that we now consider as physical phenomena and are doing a pretty good job at tracking down exactly how they happened physically, were unequivocally considered to be the direct action of the gods in the world. So back then, maybe a few centuries ago, a few thousand years ago, things were regarded as spiritual phenomena, which today everyone regards as material phenomena, because we've understood it. We've advanced along this arc of descent. And perhaps as we continue advancing, what we now think of as spiritual things may actually come under the ambit of scientific understanding and investigation. We should never feel threatened by that. This is part of the progress of the human consciousness. There's always going to be something ahead of us. There's always going to be degrees of understanding ahead of us. And at the same time, there are going to be degrees of, I just got this beautiful.
I drawed it.
Yeah, you drawed it, thank you. And at the same time, there's always going to be something in front of us and something behind us. And that's what defines a dualistic point of view. But we understand that dualistic perspectives are perspectives that are relative to where we are on this ladder of consciousness. So one can see that this, I submit, offers a bridge between Eastern and Western modes of thinking. It offers a bridge between a dualistic mode of thinking in which God is in one sphere and we're in another sphere, a bridge between that way of thinking and a more holistic way of thinking in which there's only one existence, and what we perceive is relative to where we are on that circle. So that's probably where I want to stop at the moment. Well, okay, let me add one more thing, because I promised that the circle of existence is going to solve two huge problems, and I've only mentioned one of them. And I might not have even done a good job of solving the one problem. I mean, how can you solve this problem in 5 minutes? But if the first huge problem is this rift between sort of Eastern and Western modalities of religious thinking, the second major rift is the rift between the sacred and the secular modalities of thinking. A modality of thinking in which the world is functions according to precise mathematical laws, which enable us to describe all the phenomena we're interested in describing, and a modality in which every leaf that stirs only through the permission of God's will. Those two modalities, which seem like infinitely far apart in our current way of thinking, are brought together again through the imagery of the circle of existence, that we see the world through the lens. If we're looking backwards along the arc of descent, then the best way to understand the world is through a scientific lens. And if we're looking forward to degrees of consciousness beyond the human, then the best way of looking at the world is through a spiritual lens. The tablet of Baha'u'llah that I mentioned before in the Tablet of Wisdom also I think, helps to bridge this divide by making this identity between what the scientists have always called nature and have thought of as being simply mathematical laws with no will or purpose behind it, and what the theologians, what the divine philosophers have always called the will of God and attributed it to the direct intervention of a deity in the world. Again, this seems like a chasm that's completely unbridgeable. Baha'u'llah bridges it by fiat. You know, he bridges it by saying, look, these two are really the same thing. It's a matter that it's just a matter of semantics. And ultimately they can be, both of these views can be, I think, subsumed and helpfully sort of brought together in this imagery of ever expanding birth of consciousness and the ever expanding desire of the cosmos to know itself, to use a phrase again of Carl Sagan. It says, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. It's hard for me to imagine one sentence that better encapsulates, although spoken from, by a scientist with a secular perspective, it's hard for me to imagine a sentence that has more spiritual resonance and that it encapsulates more of this idea of what the grand scheme of things is than to say that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And in doing so, we're a way for God to know itself. And we're a way for God to love its own essence. All right, that's probably more than enough for one day. We do have some time for questions. So what do you all think of these ideas? Consciousness, circle of existence, will of God, love, evolution, and spirit are ideas that I've tried to sort of bring together into one interconnected set of ideas and images.
So just let me open up here a little bit and see who's putting up their hand. Gisela, I think, put up her hand first. And if you want to know how to put up your hand, then you go into participants and click on the raise hand button. Okay, Gisela, would you like to start?
Yeah, I have two observations. Well, thank you in the first place. Wonderful. I have two observations regarding the logos. Number one, about 30 years ago, I read a book published in 1980 by Roger Garaudy, Appel au Vivant, Call to the Living, where, among other things, he gives a fantastic resume of the religions of the world. And there he mentions that the Tao in the Far East corresponds to the Logos. And he also mentions that it's not God, but the Logos or the Tao who is the creator.
Yes.
This
yes,
is
absolutely. I can recommend, I'm going to go off screen for 1 second, but I can recommend for those who are interested in the deep connections between Taoism and the Baha'i faith, and by proxy Sufism, I can highly recommend a book by a fellow by the name of Toshihiko Izutsu called Sufism and Taoism, which is not written for the general reader, goes into all sorts of detail on the Taoist texts, both Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu, as well as going deeply into a number of Sufi mystical texts, and shows just amazingly deep and unexpected connections in the fundamental conceptual frameworks of both. Although externally, from the outside, you might look in and say these should have nothing to do with each other, because Sufism is built upon a very robust monotheistic worldview, the foundation of the Quran, which has a language and imagery and overall spiritual approach which seems so directly at odds with the approach of Taoism, which is non-theistic. But it's works like this by Izutsu which help, I think, which help to bridge these divides which are still, I think, at the fringes of our consciousness, but will, I think, move more to the center, as particularly as the civilization and culture of the Far East intersects and comes into greater and greater tension with the culture of the West.
Yeah, and the second observation about logos is that we had the fantastic opportunity to be quite close to Dr. Mühlschlegel, because we lived in the same town for some time. And he mentioned that the quote you gave from St. John, the beginning of the whatever, it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was, and then the Greek is proston theon, which means toward God. It's not at God's, no, it's not with God, but towards, like, you know, the mirror towards the sun, more or less. And then it goes on, and theos ein ho logos. It's not God is the Word, but a God or divine is the logos. So, you know, as you are also busy with translations, it might be interesting.
Yes, and that same passage in the Gospel of John goes on to say, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us.
And the Word became
flesh and dwelt among us.
And dwelt among us.
In that sense, the prophet is the incarnation of the Word, and or of the primal will, which is not far from what the Baha'i writings say about the station of the prophet as being really the incarnation of the will in the world. Of course, I don't want to suggest. I mean, there's a particular Christian theology of incarnation that isn't necessarily completely compatible with what we've been talking about.
Thank you. I think the next one is Chrissia. You haven't have your hand up anymore? No. Okay, Nasreen, would you like to ask your question or comment?
Yes, I have two comments or questions. One of them, in the ascending cycle, the difference between Baha'i belief and Sufi belief, isn't it that the Sufis believe that after they go through, for example, the 7 valleys, then they reach God, while in Baha'i faith, after you go through the 7 valleys, you will kind of understand maybe the station of the manifestation of God, not God himself, because it's the unknowable essence. Is that true?
There's a longish tablet by Abdul Baha on the opinions of the Sufis, and it was published in the Journal of Baha'i Studies, volume 11. So it can be found on the website with all of these back issues of the Journals of Baha'i Studies. And in that tablet, Abdul Baha differentiates between what he calls what the generality of the Sufis believe, and what we may sort of, reading the literature that's available, we might, you know, easily encounter that, what the generalities of the Sufis believe, and then what the true masters believed. And Abdul Baha says there's a difference between them. He also, I think, says this in one of the later chapters of Some Answered Questions, the one on pantheism. It used to be called pantheism. Now it's called the unity of existence. Abdul Baha said the generality of the Sufis did believe what you said, that, you know, that one attains God, one becomes God. You know, it's a collapsing of categories. And I read a quote earlier in this session where Abdul Baha says that, you know, the Sufis believe there's two the generality, at least, of the Sufis believes that it's a 2-floor model, whereas the real savants and the Baha'is believe that it's really 3 floors, that there is still a stage which, you know, which is forever inaccessible, can't be spoken of. And so we proceed immediately to the second stage, and we talk about pantheism in those terms, and we talk about attaining the presence of God for instance, one of the main themes of the Kitab-i Gan, the Book of Certitude, is attainment to the presence of God. And Baha'u'llah in the Kitab-i Gan, in part 1, also talks about, what does this possibly mean? Could this mean attaining God in his essence? He says, no, it can't mean that. It has to mean attaining the presence of God, has to mean attaining at that next level down, at the level of the primal will, at the level of the manifestation, which is the physical representation and all we have to point to in this world that is an indication of that ultimately ineffable degree of being.
My second comment or question is that when you mentioned there is only one existence and it depends where we are in this circle of existence, could we imagine this circle not flat, but like a cone? If we are talking about that consciousness or spirit and how consciousness evolves, then to me it looks more like a cone going, well, I'm not going to say vertical or horizontal, but we usually imagine that it is horizontal, like you're going up higher and higher. And as if everybody is trying to climb up a mountain, it depends on where we are climbing up on this mountain. We look back, there are people behind us who are trying the same thing. And there are people who are in the same level that we are. There are people who are further. But when we reach the top of the mountain and we look back, everybody's trying to come. So that's why we don't judge people. We are all trying to advance our consciousness and our understanding.
Yeah, I hear two ideas there. One is the idea that, you know, as we advance, we see people in different levels, and we see people, quote unquote, behind us, but we realize that we're all sort of advancing along this mountain. For that, you don't need it to be a coil or a spiral. I mean, it could just be a circle, and you never reach, you know, because the human, for all of our spiritual advancement, we never actually reach the level of God. It's an asymptote, you know. It's a never-ending process to reach back. But the idea about it being a spiral or a coil is an interesting one, and it touches, I think, on the point that Parto made yesterday. You know, when a universal cycle is completed, you know, is all memory of the last cycle erased? So it just returns, you know, so it's just a circle that goes around and around, or is there somehow something that is maintained or retained from the previous cycle, so that one can say that one never really starts back exactly at the starting point, but you're somehow advanced farther along? I have to say, I guess that's ultimately an open question, and one upon which I imagine there'll be continued conversation about it in the years to come, because but it's a fundamentally important question, though. I mean, is time cyclical or is time linear? We don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Duncan.
Yeah, hi. Thanks again for a fascinating talk this evening. I'm trying to grapple with a lot of the ideas. I just wondered, are you putting this material together in a book or study guide or something of that kind? I don't know, so apologies if that's already been mentioned as an introduction to the course and I missed it, but it just seems that there's a lot to grapple with here and a lot that might be very useful in lots of different types of application, but probably requires even more reflection than like a summer school setting.
Yeah.
I'd certainly be interested if something like that is in the works or if there's other resources or that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that comment. And I do have long-term plans to put this in book form. Over the last 5 or so years, I've been iterating on it more in like summer school environments, because every iteration from feedback that I receive and from, you know, continuing to read and think about it, it keeps evolving and changing. And so it hasn't yet reached the point where I feel like I can put it in book form. But the raw materials for it are found in these various, you know, YouTube videos and so forth, and also I'll mention it and just briefly share a screen so you can see it. The raw materials are almost in their entirety found at the website loomofreality.org, which I maintain, which contains 5,000 or 6,000 quotations from the Baha'i writings and beyond. Although it focuses on the Baha'i writings, it does have a lot of quotations from other faith traditions. That's quite a lot on Plotinus and Plato and so forth. But it attempts to take the idea of some of these basic ideas and present the raw materials that have led to the views that I'm expressing in these classes. You know, so for example, the idea of the primal will, and what is the primal will? How is it related to God? How is it related to the realm of command, or the word of God, or the logos, and all of these things? And how is it related to creation? And is it the cause? And is it the inner reality of things, and so forth? There are, as you see, sometimes dozens of quotations underlying each statement. So the idea that I mentioned briefly earlier on the self-generation of the primal will, that seems like a pretty crazy idea. There happens to be at least, I don't know, 20 quotations I've pulled out from various sources, most of them Baha'i sources, although some of them, this is from Sheikh Ahmad, you know, there's some things from the Bab, a lot of these are provisional translations, a lot of things I'm finding in Plotinus about it. But most of it is from the Baha'i writings about the idea of the self-generation of the primal will. That's just an example, but of how there's just a lot of raw materials stacked in here. It may be a little bit difficult to navigate because it's several sections deep, the outline, and where I've put things may not map entirely onto the way that you understand these things and would have put these things, but you can always use the search box.
Thanks, that's helpful. Thanks.
And I should also mention, just very briefly, that there's another version of that outline that ought to be easier to navigate. At the blog version, there's the loom.loomofreality.com, and then there's blog.loomofreality.com. And at the moment, there's only one blog entry, which is an inventory of the works of the central figures of the Baha'i faith, which is mostly a list of manuscript sources that wouldn't be relevant to our conversation today. But in an appendix to it, there's a subject classification scheme that takes the same raw materials in this other outline and presents it in a slightly flatter kind of ontology that lines up very roughly with Immanuel Kant's questions of knowledge. You know, what can we know? What should we do? And for what can we hope? That's from Kant's critique of pure reason. And that breaks up further into questions of being, of knowledge, of conduct, of governance, and of history. And then within each of these, say you're interested in going back to the primal will, if we're interested in God and the realm of the divine will, then underneath that super category, if we go down, there's all these subcategories about, and it includes things about the primal will, for example, which really takes the same raw materials that were in the loom of reality, but it just produces it in a slightly different logical form. So for those who are interested in digging deep into any particular topics that I've brought up, this is where I get all my ideas from, pretty much. So and any quotes I find that are relevant make their way ultimately into this compilation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So no book yet, but it's all still in kind of semi-organized form.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Osman, for putting the links of these things in the chat. And just to mention that you can download the chat by clicking on the three dots in the chat as you open it up. The next question is from Parto, or comment.
Thank you very much. Just a short notion that actually it's more an educational point that I would like to make, that everything that that Stephen has been telling us here yesterday and today, I wasn't the day before yesterday, is I think a really good reminder of the fact that reality makes sense. You know, I work with young students, international students at the university a lot. And in my series of courses, the whole point of those courses is to help them to understand that reality is not a senseless, meaningless, pointless place, but actually it makes sense. And of course, they're all non-Baha'is. And what I find out is that, especially young people, they find it extremely comforting to realize this, that even the chaos and the evil and all the bad things that are happening actually make sense in a broader picture. And I think this is a really, because Steven was saying that, okay, I hope I can get more to the practical level and so on. We should not belittle the importance of holistic, if you want to call it theoretic, understanding. It is extremely important because it helps to make sense of the world. Because, I mean, one way to look at reality is that God has written basically two books. One is nature, the physical creation, actually, and the other is the actual revelation of the revealed words of God. Both of them are revealed in a manner that are organic, stochastic, even chaotic, kind of random. And it's for us, our job is to make sense of it, to understand it, to study it, to put the pieces together. It is a puzzle, but the puzzle, it is a real puzzle. It has a picture to be made. So the point is that there is a sense to be made, but it's not obvious necessarily. And that has been the mistake of most of the divines and the clergy in history, that they just take it and make silly interpretations of it. Whereas scientists actually are far closer to the Baha'i concept of understanding reality, in the sense that they try to make sense of the seeming chaoticness of it. They try to put things together. And when Shoghi Effendi says in his statement to actually it was at the occasion of the United Nations, I won't go to the history of that, when he mentions that the Baha'i faith is scientific in its method, it means that we try to make sense because there is a sense to be made. It's just not always obvious. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you, of course, for the wonderful presentation to Steven, because this whole thing helps us to be aware that it's not just a theoretic philosophical thing and we are just talking about it in this. It is a very practical thing, especially for young people. They become encouraged. They feel that there can be a purpose in life. There can be meaning to be understood and gained. Sorry for the
certainly
comments.
felt in the years that I've spent pulling together these quotations and thinking about them, I've always felt that I was on the trail of some mystery and the clues were scattered around, and I just had to find them all and assemble them, like puzzle pieces. A big box of puzzle pieces has been shaken up and scattered throughout the Baha'i writings, and it was my job, or my self-assigned job, to sort of try to figure out what all the puzzle pieces are and find out in what order they're supposed to be locking together. And what I'm presenting over these few days is the best I've come up with in trying to lock all the ideas together. And I feel that there is a structure and an order to it. At the same time, I recognize, and this is going to come out a lot more explicitly tomorrow, that no single framework is going to satisfy everybody. Some people are always going to look at the world in different ways. And so somehow we have to, so even this meta narrative of consciousness and the circle of creation, all that, some people look at it and say, oh, that's just, that sounds like nonsense to me. That doesn't, doesn't hold any water for me. And we have to recognize that as well, that there's going to have to be different doorways that people enter through. And this may be a doorway that a lot of people could potentially enter through that wouldn't otherwise enter through the doorway of the traditional theological language, God sent another prophet with another book. This narrative is sort of overarching that, and it includes other ways of approach.
The next question we have is from Fariba.
Right, thanks. So it's like a question and a comment. So thank you so much for today's presentation. I will definitely be visiting Loom because there are so many of these thoughts and ideas, and it's really lovely to have these spaces. Firstly, building on one of these quotes that you gave on Baha'u'llah, I believe it's from the long obligatory prayer, through whom the letters B and E have been joined together, and you were talking about kun from the Arabic and how it translates well into the English. It just brought to mind the tablet of visitation of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, where Baha'u'llah says, I testify moreover that with but a movement of thy pen, thine injunction, be thou, hath been enforced, and God's hidden secret has been divulged, and all created things have been called into being, and all the revelations have been sent down. So I think that's another reference again to the primal will, to the manifestations of God, that middle layer, bringing into being all creation, even all the manifestations being brought into being by that middle layer. And again, really appreciate that you mentioned that even, and there are more and more, I'm actually going to even put some Persian evenings where they are mentioned, there's mention being made that even monotheism, even talking about one God, even to have a number one is giving an attribute to God. Even calling God a creator is giving an attribute to God. God is above all names and attributes. Even to talk about names and attributes, once we're talking about that, we've come to the middle realm. And therefore, it's either something of our own, whatever is of our own construction, or we're, as you put it today, we're anthropomorphizing God. We're giving our attributes and qualities to God, which we can't do. But in the form of a question, what I had was that I have recently been more interested in the bayan, the Persian bayan of the Bab, and I believe at the very, very start, he makes reference to this primal will. So I was really happy that you discussed this. And in English, I haven't seen that much of a translation of it. Do you know, other than what we have in selections from the writings of the Bab, what parts of the Persian bayan are translated, particularly pertaining to the primal will?
There is a, everything I've found on it is in Loom. So if you go under Primal Will, you'll find lots of bits and pieces quoting the Persian Bayan by Vahed and Bab, by chapter and verse, and so you can find it there. But there's, yeah, it's scattered throughout the Bayan, and I certainly don't know that I have all those pieces, but whenever I've come across pieces from the Bayan that discuss the Primal Will, I've put it in that compilation.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Cheers.
It's available also if you can find it in French, and that introductory passage where where the Bab says that creation was created to for the sake of him who points towards God. I think something to that effect is also included there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, it's Ingeborg.
Hello, am I live at the moment?
No. Yes, you are.
Oh, okay,
Yes,
yeah. I'm Ingeborg's husband, Robert.
Okay, sorry.
In Germany. Thank you very much, Stephen, for that wonderful presentation. I've got a question about this idea of the evolution of consciousness in the world, and because it reminded me of some ideas that I know vaguely about from Hegel. And I wondered if you are aware of any connection in some of the ideas on that topic from Hegel that might have influenced some Baha'i ideas, perhaps.
I don't know if there's a direct line from Hegel to any Baha'i thinkers. I do know that Nader Saidi is familiar with Hegel's works and mentions Hegel I think in both of his books. Hegel certainly had this idea of history being the unfolding of spirit. His phenomenology of spirit talks about that. The strange thing about Hegel is that as brilliant as he was, he didn't see the further evolution of spirit. Now, he saw spirit evolving up until the point that it reaches its perfect consummate form in the state of Germany in 1850, whatever the year he was living. It's like, how can you not sort of lift yourself out of your own historical context when you're talking about history in this sort of broad sense? But that minor quibble aside, certainly I think Hegel can bring a lot to this conversation of and provide a lot of points of contact in meaningful conversations with people who are involved in this set of ideas, because the concept of spirit, of history being the unfolding of spirit, is one of the most fundamental ideas in Hegel.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Thanks.
It's now Björn, Bastian.
I'm happy I could listen to your talk tonight, Steve. And for my ears, you were talking about perspectives. It was mainly a narrative of growing consciousness. I think your thought that we need a common narrative framework in accordance with our different views for profound unified action in the world is something I find very fruitful. And then you were speaking about this book showing how much Sufism and Taoism have in common. And I find this fascinating too, which is just my remark that this is the warning. If you have a look at other narratives, you may need to go very deeply and understand them well to see how much they have in common already without having a new narrative, which makes people come together to be able to take unified action in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Without books like Sufism and Taoism, it would be very difficult, I think, for the vast majority of people to see any meaningful connection between them, and thus to be able to bridge them. And so it's a lifetime project to bridge any two sub-narratives, let alone try to find a way to bridge sort of all the narratives in the world, so to speak. It's certainly more than any individual can take on.
Thank you very much. I think there's no other hands up at the moment, and we've gone quite a bit over time. So I'm going to take this opportunity to say a fantastic thank you